People who die, they didn't fail, they learned something. Like there's so much available to us if we just see the truth that there is no failure. There's no failure. It's an illusion.
Dr. Kyra Bobinet, thank you so much. It is such an honor and a privilege to introduce you to my audience. And if you could do the honors and give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and why you do it to get us started.
Yeah, it's really great to be here with you and your audience as well. My background, I guess you could say, is multiphasic. I started out as a scientist, a research scientist, went into clinical medicine, then went into behavior change in the social settings, like youth leaving incarceration kind of level, which is kind of like a random side thing, but really, really taught me a lot. Then went into public health, was in a very, enormous corporate healthcare company, designing things behavior change wise for 33 million people at a time and covering wellness to illness and birth to death. Like, so the whole gamut of how we show up as humans. And then I went to Stanford wanting more training in behavior design with my mentor, BJ Fogg, started my company, and it evolved into a software that is designed for the brain. And we can get into that, but that's kind of where I sit now and do research also alongside that because I never stopped being a research scientist.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you have discovered? I heard you say behavior change, and then I
Mhm.
also heard you say behavior design. Do you want to speak a little bit to the difference or the nuances between those terms and also what you have maybe overarching discovered over the course of your career?
Yeah. So behavior change, I didn't know this, but when I first went to medical school, my inclination was about behavior change because every time I had a patient who came back and said, "Nah, doc, I forgot," or "Oh, no, I haven't been taking my medicine," or, "Yeah, I promised I would do that, but I didn't do it," or just ghosted me entirely. And I just started more and more as the more patients I saw, I realized that there was this problem that we all had that I didn't have a name for yet. But it was when people meant to do something and then they didn't do it and then they felt bad. It was such a universal experience. But I wasn't taught anything about that. I wasn't trained in that. And it wasn't until I was at that big healthcare company and I was running a mindfulness-based metabolic syndrome study looking at, can mindfulness help us to improve our metabolic health, that I ran into one of our patients that I did a midterm interview with that had said something to the effect of like, it's going great, but I know what to do. I just don't do it. Kind of like, what do you got for me? And
Yeah.
so that was kind of my DNA as a behavior change, passionate investigator, somebody who wants to invent in that area. Behavior design is somewhat of a loose cadre of tools and translational science, from usually from behavioral psychology into the design of products, into the design of behaviors, oftentimes in the healthcare space, but also in the financial space. And I saw this as a tool for me to train in that to better understand how to change behavior because I didn't get any training in my other two programs. And in the process of that, my own twist on the matter was to really start, diving into neuroscience because I felt like if I had a premise of anatomically what the brain is doing, I would have a lot more confidence in core truth, first principles, that this is, we found ground. And I really wanted to give that to people so that it wasn't just, oh, Kyra's cute little theories about, this or that.
Yeah, I found you first with your Unstoppable Brain book. And
Mm.
then I went back to the Well-Designed Life. And I
Mhm.
noticed, correct me if I'm wrong, but the iterative mindset as a concept or a term didn't seem to be in book one, although you could see the foreshadowing and the birth of the mindset in that book. And going back to that first book, I've been able to apply so much and offer help to my own clients because continuing to send yourself into the same situation and expect different results
Mm-hmm.
is kind of the definition of insanity.
Mm-hmm.
Like using willpower, okay, I'm not going to drink tonight, or
Hold your breath.
yeah, I'm going to control my, like, it's going to be different this time. Put me in,
Right.
coach. Like, I feel so good, amazing in this
Right.
moment, thinking about the future and then sending yourself in. And I've used your concepts of the well-designed life to show people that no, you got to set your little habit self up,
Mm-hmm.
increasing the resistance on the bad behavior and decreasing the resistance on the behaviors you want to see. Like, you do have to plan a little bit. That being said, there is this whole other reason why all of the best laid plans go to waste when there's a problem in the brain with the motivation. And
Mm-hmm.
so I really speak to what I identify with your approach is this whole, the entry point to this neural pathway, the identifier is I know what I should be doing and I just can't do it. I know exactly what it is, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not doing it. And I know you refer to it as the no do gap. And
Mm-hmm.
when I first heard that, saw the word no, like no, no
Yeah.
do. And then I
Yeah.
saw it in print and it was no do. And I'm like,
Right.
well, it works either way. Will you explain a little bit more what the no do gap is?
Yeah. So, you kind of already got us there, but the no part, KNOW, as you point out, is I know what I want. I know what would fix. People are brilliant at knowing what they should do and what they want to do, but all of us fall short on actually doing it. And that latter part is what I'm fixated on. Because you take something like precision medicine, which is like your DNA says you have this risk and you would do well with this many carbs. Like, yeah, there's like probably less than 5% of people who can like really, really dig that and really like glom on and follow it perfectly. And then 95% of us, and I'm in the latter category, who, would never be able to follow that so prescriptively, and our lives would just crush any structure that we had with that. And that's where things like SMART goals or tracking against your goals fall short and actually set us up to fail. We can talk about that. And that, that the no do gap was the first clue that there was this brain area that was operating, that was causing this gap to happen. And we can get into that as well. And so that's the common universal suffering that we all face, no matter what we're trying to change, whether it's a full-blown addiction, a partial addiction, or, just something pesky.
Yeah. Well, and what I love to say is if you actually knew what you should be doing, you would be doing it. So looking at the no do gap as an invitation to dig deeper and with curiosity. Of course, you can't have curiosity if your habenula has been shut down. What I
Mhm.
want to do is I want to talk about the habenula, but before I want to kind of foreshadow it. You talk in your first book about there were two studies on the motivation. Um, there are two studies that reveal that there's a kill switch on our motivation. And so
Mhm.
this seemed to give birth to what has now become your iterative mindset. Can you talk about what you discovered in the studies that led
Yeah.
you to identify the kill switch?
Yeah. So just to be clear, this is not my research. We'll get to my research, but these two studies were two totally different labs. And it's almost like Reese's peanut butter and chocolate. Like one of them had discovered that if you think you failed at something, a new area that they didn't know turned on before was the main thing that turned on. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. And then the second study, the second group, found that if this area of your body, your brain turned on, then you lost motivation to keep trying a behavior. And so I was the first one, to my knowledge, to put those two things together. And at the time of the publication of the first book, that's all that existed in the literature. I had never heard of the habenula. Nobody else who I, knew as a doctor or a scientist knew about the habenula. I think one neurologist was like, "Yeah, I remember it from like anatomy lab." Like that. That was it. It was just like a little marker, right? But it wasn't, characterized at all until we had, as a society, we had more modern technologies like something called functional MRI, which shows the blood flow in very specific ways in very tiny areas of the brain. And only until we found that did we start to kind of parse out the power of the habenula.
Can you go ahead and explain physiologically what's going on when
Yeah.
we know what we should do and we are not doing? And what is the habenula, please?
Right. So my own hypothesis connects the two, just like in the first book, I connected those two pieces. Um, so what the literature shows though, is if you are looking, if an animal is looking at something that they want to do, they're calculating in their head, is this going to work out for me or am I going to fail? So there's a perception of failure that they're activating. And this area of the brain is like, oh no, honey, you're gonna fail because you failed at that a million times over, right? This is a classic sort of habenula hit or habenula scar from having failure in the past that is still alive in us. And so our habenula looks at that and it's like, and so we quit. We don't even try. You know, some people I call it pre-failing in the second book. You know, some people don't even approach at all because they're like, that's not going to work out for me. And so the habenula is two things. One is it's looking out for failure, and if it finds it, it turns on. This is the lateral habenula for those who are really sciencey. The second thing it does is it is a brake pedal for our car if our gas pedal was the dopamine reward system. So it has dominance over dopamine. It has dominance over serotonin more recently. It has dominance over prefrontal cortex and our breathing. That was like the most recent study, our digestion, our sense of stress. Like this is the kind of like central hub. And it makes sense because if you look at the brain anatomy, if you had a brain in your hand, like a little plastic brain or something, it would be directly in the middle, like the deepest kind of area to get to. And so it has all these other, controls and extensions of itself, but it is the main operator of motivation. And therefore, when we lose motivation, when we don't do the thing that we know we want to or should, then this is the part of our brain that is by de facto on.
So it sounds like then no matter how much you want to do something and need to do something, if there is a part of you that believes it's not going to work out because of either fear of failure or matching to failures of the past, and
Yeah.
the little scorekeeper in your brain says we're not investing resources into a lost cause, and
Mm-hmm.
it puts on the brakes. So
Yep.
this sense that I should be doing this and I'm not doing that, that's actually a very real physical phenomenon. You're not making that up, and it doesn't mean something is wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a perception that,
Mm-hmm.
as we'll talk more about, you can
Mm-hmm.
fix.
Mm-hmm.
But until you understand that that's the problem, beating yourself up for not performing as expected is actually making it worse, which I know for the work that I do with alcohol use disorder, to me, this is the birth of alcohol use disorder. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with how much or how often you drink. It is
Mm-hmm.
how many times you've woken up and beaten yourself up for the fact
That's
that
right.
you're an embarrassment or you failed, that is actually what then paints you into the corner and moves you into the ramp of addiction, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the belief that you can't control yourself, or you're not going to, or it's going to be hard in some
Mm-hmm.
way because there's
Mm-hmm.
something wrong inherently with you.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about maybe the new knitting, if you will, between, did you read Dopamine Nation
Oh, yes.
by Ann Lemke?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So maybe your audience knows this already, but I'll just review kind of in summary to set this up. So if I'm at 0 point here, okay, and then I'm going to go, this is the positive experience and this is the negative experience side of the number scale. And so when I do something to search for something desirable or comforting or my drug of choice or my substance of choice, I'm using dopamine to kind of like search and look for that item. And then what happens is that there is a -2 penalty. If you look at behavioral economics, loss is twice as powerful as gain. So your brain's not going to let you get away with a +1. It's going to take you back -2. So now you're on this side of the number line of 0. And then every time you try to rebalance, you get knocked, for every 1 point towards the positive, you get knocked 2 to the negative. Now we're going to go over the hope that this engenders, but it turns out that with recent studies, the habenula is the cause of that -2, that pain side of the equation. Like it's going to give you twice as much pain as you had pleasure a moment ago. And then what that does is it causes craving. It causes habenula is the reason for withdrawal feelings, whether the withdrawal thoughts or withdrawal like physiological cravings, physical cravings that you have, or that negativity bias, that beating yourself up. It's working with the prefrontal cortex in that way to penalize myself, to keep myself in that sort of downward spiral in this direction. So now that we kind of understand that model, what we can do is start to deal with what's actually wrong, which is the failure. Because if you neutralize the failure, as opposed to resting dopamine and just sitting on your hands and like dealing with the withdrawal symptoms, withdrawal is simply an active fire of failure in your mind. And it drives this restless, itchy, like crawling out of your skin feeling that everybody who's been addicted to everything, and by the way, everybody's addicted to something,
Oh, yeah.
normalize
Check your
that.
phone. It's been
Yeah,
30 seconds.
totally, totally. My kids are like complete addicts into their phones, and I'm working on that. So, but it's the failure thoughts. It's the subconscious sense of I'm wrong. This is wrong. I'm not getting what I need. I'm not getting what I want. I'm failing at living. I'm failing at learning. All of that stuff, which a lot of us are programmed, including myself, from childhood to carry those voices in our heads, right? So that's what's happening. It's not that anybody gets any pleasure out of the substance of abuse. It's that we're trying to shut up the pain of having our habenula turned on. And my hypothesis is that if we just turn it off directly and we know it's on and we know how to work with it, there's freedom.
Is this why, in my own history, I look back and I realized that my drinking problem, I arguably was dependent on alcohol long before I realized there was a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until I started thinking that I'm drinking too much, and a lot of women I talk to experience the same thing. They drank like assholes in college, and binging, but it was normal and it didn't seem out that they were a failure. They were just,
Right,
I'll stop
right.
this when I'm out of college.
Sure.
So are you in agreement then that it's not all or nothing for sure? There are physiological components and withdrawal, with the dopamine reset, but it also is an emotional component that I want more than I should have, and that this is somehow hard. Are you speaking that it is emotional and physical?
I think we experience it as emotional.
Okay.
What I think is happening electronically, just to go like with anatomically, is that our habenula is lighting up because we have, some thought that gets it to turn on, right? And then for some people, what's recently been proven about the habenula and withdrawal symptoms is that if you have a shrunken habenula, you are more likely to already have depressive symptoms, and you are going to have the strongest symptoms of withdrawal from your addictive substance, which, by the way, is not just numbing you out, but is distracting you from the habenula. And so
Yeah.
then you've got nothing to defend yourself with.
Yeah.
The habenula is on, it's wreaking havoc in your mind. You feel like a total failure, or you've lost all motivation, you've lost belief in yourself, you're depressed, or you're anxious, and you want to reach for that. So that's hyperkaphia, which is the experience of that withdrawal, the intensity of that withdrawal is higher in people who have compromised or shrunken habenula. And so
When
my thesis is that I think we can recover the habenula. I think we can train it just like a muscle.
Oh,
I think we can build it up, with neuroplasticity to be on our side and to be stronger for us so that we have the ability to, stand up to
Yeah.
our addiction feelings.
I would say I would be an anecdotal evidence that you can. So when I first quit drinking, I did the AA route
Mhm.
and did the sobriety thing and was sober almost 3 years, and then decided for a variety of reasons to go ahead and reintroduce alcohol. And after 3 years of being sober, my first introduction with alcohol, I had maybe a third of a glass of wine. I mean, I was very thoughtful. I thought about it for a few months. I made a plan. If I did wake up the addiction monster, I said, well, I've crawled out of that hole. I know how to ask for help. That's one
Mhm.
thing that's different. I'm safe
That's nice.
to
Mhm.
reintroduce. But what I noticed, and this is where the foundation of my program came, was, oh my God, after 3 years, the shame that I felt, I hadn't processed it. It had just gone dormant because I was avoiding that shame with good
Mhm.
behavior. And
Right.
so that is where, with what I learned is, after a third of a glass of wine, I felt sick for like 2 days,
Wow.
and having to process it was all emotional, and I knew it. And
Hmm.
so having to walk through that myself gave me a first row seat to what it looks like to overcome alcohol use disorder. And it
Hmm.
really isn't about the alcohol, especially if you've broken the addiction long ago. I was 3 years sober. And
Hmm.
then now, being able to see that in action and know how to respond, what's emotional and what's actually, I just got overserved. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of felt sensation and awareness of my own mind and body that I've
Hmm.
had to work through. That's key. So I think it's really important to understand that the way you feel is not just a product of objective reality. It's also the story you're telling yourself, your fears, all of that.
Were you always self-aware?
I would have told you I was amazingly self-aware.
Hmm.
And in hindsight, my definition of emotional intelligence was I could tell you what everybody else was thinking. And it turns out my thoughts about their thoughts were still my thoughts. So, no, I was not self aware. I had
Well,
no
the
idea.
story has a lot of self-awareness in it, which I love. You have this kind of witness, as they say in meditation circles, watching yourself do the thing, watching yourself think the thing, which I'm sure you work on with your clients. But that's just it's a powerful locus of control, as they call it in psychology, a way to just really ground with, like, and allows you to say, my habenula is not me, my thoughts are not me, these stories are not me, where did I get these? I've never heard anybody so perfectly describe the dissection between, when you go abstinent, you are not dealing with the things with what happens when you trigger the habenula,
Yeah.
and
That's,
you did that perfectly just now. Like, I think it's so clear that that's different
yeah.
from working through with that, which is one of the advantages. If somebody can tolerate it and do well with it, that's one of the advantages of, like, more the harm reduction route, is that
Hmm.
you're actively blocking and tackling with life as it presents itself. And if
Yeah.
that's not too overwhelming, too much too soon,
Yeah.
that helps you to integrate, you know, um, these mental habits, is all they are, these
Yeah.
stories, and really be able to, like, question them, rewrite them,
Yeah.
reframe them. And I'd rather take somebody who's done a bit of that work
Yeah.
and put them up against the world, than somebody who is, essentially withdrawing and then just removing the stimulus. If they can, great. But
Yeah.
as we see with so many people, sometimes that backfires. You're just kind of
Yeah.
holding your, fingers, and then all of a sudden they'll fall off a cliff, and, don't have any tools to deal with the
Yeah.
habenula because they haven't ever met it.
Well, that's where I work with women is using your work. I
Hmm.
teach them to fail, not to succeed. And so much out there is about changing your
Beautiful.
behavior, which if you can get abstinence, but at some point, if you pour alcohol on those old beliefs, whether you get served accidentally. I remember going to a resort, all inclusive, asking for a, vodka free vodka cranberry, just no vodka, and getting what I thought was a mocktail, and then being halfway through it and realizing when I stood up, that was a familiar feeling. I hadn't had a drink in years. There was a
Mhm.
sensation in my muscles, and it
Mhm.
triggered a stress response
Mm.
where, because I was still in the AA mindset, oh my
Yeah,
God, there's alcohol on
I
board. And
failed. Yeah.
I started to freak out. I was able to calm that, but that's the tools that people need. That's why first of all, I have a certain threshold of drinker that I bring into my program,
Mhm.
but then I don't have them stop drinking, because you
Mhm.
cannot process this until we have access to the shame. And
Mhm. Mhm.
perfect behavior to avoid the shame does not set you up
Mhm.
for being able to actually handle what, I also use trauma response to describe
Mhm.
what's happening. We've traumatized ourselves over and over, beating ourselves up. And
Mhm.
so the alcohol can trigger that trauma response. So learning, like, if you knew what you should be doing, you would already be doing it. The reason is you don't know what you should be doing because you're stuck in a trauma response, which is that depression, that freeze response of and helplessness, and I can't keep
Mhm.
going. And so
Mhm.
these are the tools that I teach that are transforming people,
Mhm.
and while they're still consuming alcohol and able to address their drinking habits. But I want to get back to what you do, and I want to talk about
Mhm.
the moment. At least I saw it kind of cinematically in my mind. You were talking about the Fortune 500 research project that you were doing, and then you found Dr. Chu's panel of the expert patients who were
Mhm.
able to work their way out of, I don't know if it was metabolic syndrome or those symptoms of heart
Different
disease.
diseases. Yeah.
And
Mhm.
all of a sudden, you see what you now term as the iterative mindset kind of emerge from the data.
Mhm.
Can you talk about the turning point where, especially between book one and book two, and in your
Yeah.
research, you discovered or gave word to this iterative mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. So, having written the first book, I was aware of how important motivation loss was, how important learned helplessness was, how that was really disproportionate in people who have had tough lives, or unresolved trauma, to your point. And so those people have more, delicate or hyperactive habenula,
Okay.
with response to the same cue. And so I didn't know that yet, but I was going into this research, and I'd always, always, always wanted to know, what is it that causes people to change permanently? And so I only did research on people in the Walmart project, with frontline workers, of people who had changed their lives substantially for a long period of time. And then at the same time, I just happened to be teaching a class at the School of Medicine at Stanford. And Dr. Chu, my lab director there, he just so brilliant. He had this whole panel of like expert patients in liver cancer and cardiac myopathy and all kinds of, arthritis and debilitating disease and diabetes type 1 and all these things. And I was just like, these are super brilliant people. But hanging out with them and watching them teach the medical students over and over again, I think it was just the pattern recognition that finally occurred. It just kind of popped. I was like, oh, like they're iterating. That's why they're so good. And one of them, this woman named Britt Johnson, who I mentioned in the first book, Well Designed Life, she basically said, my body's like an old car. I just tinker, like I'm an old car enthusiast, like tinkering and tweaking it until it works again. And so like that was like the first clue of like, oh, there's iteration going on here. And it's happening over here in product design. I'm in Silicon Valley, and all of that focus kind of seeped into my thinking, and Stanford's a big hub for that. There's these patients, and then in the field, in, rural America, and in areas that are not economically as robust as other areas, there are these brilliant genius people who are taking care of themselves, even though they don't have two nickels to rub together to go to Weight Watchers, they'll like walk to their, their mailbox and back, and then to their neighbor's mailbox and back, and they just figure out with their creativity what to do. And I found it fascinating. And then I was like, oh, if those people are special, can we make everybody like them? Is this a methodology that is emerging? And it turns out that, years later, we've proven that and more.
So, just for the listener, can
Mhm.
you explain the word iterative and iterative mindset and what is an iteration?
Mhm. Yeah, so iteration kind of comes, I'm talking about like definition number 5 in the dictionary, because some people get distracted that iteration just means repeating something. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's repeating something with versions in between that are adjustments and tweaks and evolutions of your last idea, your last design, right? And so you're iterating your way. And what I found is that by iterating their way, they never triggered this idea that I failed because they could always iterate, what's next to iterate, that they didn't care about the failure part. And so it never landed on them. They were like, water in a duck's back.
So the framework of failure is bookended between a start and a finish line where you have to get there and then I guess you get a trophy and an award and everybody claps for you,
Right.
but we don't realize that's a story that we're telling ourselves, and that if you zoom out, we're just every single day is a new day and
Hmm.
everything's changing over time, and
Hmm.
it's far better to learn how to adjust and look at your data, your results wherever you are today as neutral, and then
Hmm.
do I want more or less? Is this
Hmm.
better or worse than yesterday? And then
Hmm.
looking at the design that created those results and then
Hmm.
moving the ball down the field
Yeah,
without the idea that there's an end zone. Oh no,
right.
this is just how we live our lives.
That's right. That's right. It's a very different, and that's why I call it a mindset, because it's what you believe will succeed is what a mindset is. Some people, all of us who have been trained by this society to be performers, I mean, I went to really good schools. I was surrounded by people like this, like me, who just like flog ourselves and we're so good at jumping through hoops and acing certain tests, performing at a certain type of intelligence. And but then every single one of us, every single one of them, my colleagues and peers, were using negative, abusive language and thoughts in their head to drive themselves to these superhuman feats. And then the side effect was suicidality, depression, addiction, quitting, like all kinds of funky, funky, funky. Because if you're too rigid about what you're evaluating, like, if I don't get this or I'm not this by this time, oh my gosh, you're setting yourself up for a world of hurt because you're setting yourself up for failure. And so that's why iteration and iterative thinking is so protective because it just keeps your habenula like nothing to
Yeah.
see here.
I see so many women who identify with the growth mindset. Everybody knows how to have a growth mindset at work
Mhm.
and, see yourself in a process of change. But nobody teaches us to do that in our personal lives. And in fact, I think our culture over the last few decades, it's just like the shoelace getting around wound around your bicycle pedal. With every generation, it gets tighter and tighter, where
Mhm.
we think this performance that we're taught at school and on the fields and in music and competitions, that somehow becomes how we talk to ourselves. And I
Mhm.
just want you to
Yeah.
juxtapose the difference, if you could, between performance and the iterative mindset. And I'd like you to do it in terms of the apps where you track, the
Mhm.
tracking apps. Like so many of my clients
Yeah.
have tried the reframes or the sunny sides, and what happens with extended use, it's actually working against them. Can you explain why?
Yeah, absolutely. So building on what kind of things that we've said is that if you have a rigid idea of what success is, then you have narrowed the world of possibilities to this one perfect sequence and deadline. And the chances of that actually working out exactly as it should is somewhat on the order of like, logs of fractions of probabilities. And so instead of that, what is protective is thinking of the world as what's next. And I'm just going to iterate my way through this. Performance-based goal orientation, which is what it's called in literature, has been shown to be the cause of quitting, maladaptive behaviors, anxiety, cheating, like lying, like all kinds of funky ways because we're trying to protect our ego from the failure. And so we want to keep up appearances. I mean, just anybody you could ever look at who's gone into a scandal of any kind, they were just trying to protect their ego because they were being performative and they were going to get caught and they didn't want to get caught because that would be a failure. And they just kind of like, just tuned out and then they got caught. So those kinds of things are just everywhere that we can see people, we can see the cracks in the armor. We can see the emperor has no clothes on with these performative methods. They're awesome short term. If I want to have a grocery list and go today, maybe I'll make it, maybe I won't, but like that's a single transactional thing. Once I get there, I'm gonna buy what's on the list or whatever, and maybe I cheat and get more or whatever the things may be. But the point being that, if I am constantly performing with everything, to your point, even at work, like I know people apply growth mindset at work, but they don't sometimes really, because they'll default back to the norm because we're also indoctrinated with it of performance-based goals and performance-based outcomes.
Yeah.
And we just don't know how to have that conversation at work, even in my company. Like we've got iterative goals and then we have performance goals, and they kind of, interface with each other in ways that we're just learning because we're
Yeah.
trying to deprogram ourselves from just being performative.
Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
and it also leads to the mind body disconnect because as long as you're managing your behavior and it's not maybe all that natural, you're suppressing the emotions because you have to ignore those parts of yourself. It's not okay for you to feel like a failure, or it's not okay for you to hit your mark today. And so the more time we spend in these performative roles where it makes us start to view ourselves from the outside in, and we
Mhm.
lose connection with ourselves because and start to foster the belief that we're not really who we say we are. We're
Mhm.
actually full of shit. And everybody sees us as perfect or high performance, but that's not who we really are. And so that's how the divide grows between who we show the world and how we have these feelings that then are unprocessed and just bloom into that imposter syndrome, shame, all of that. And it's very scary because you can't admit to the world that you're full of shit. But that's, I always say like the first step to being okay is actually to say, you know what, I'm not okay. And that's the gap. Can we spend some time on showing the idea that failure is actually a word, not a
Mhm.
real thing?
Yeah.
Failure is a matrix, it's a mental construct,
Mhm.
and that word probably does more damage. Just the idea of a failure, like there actually is no such thing as failure. Will you say a little more
Mhm.
about that?
Mhm. Yeah. So failure is an illusion.
Yeah.
I've never met anybody who like abject failed. Even if somebody's living under a bridge in a box, they haven't failed, they're still alive. People who die, they didn't fail, they learned something. Like there's so much available to us if we just see the truth that there is no failure. There's no failure, it's an illusion. There is a difference between what we expected and what we wanted and what happened, for sure. Happens all the time in health. But there is this label that just, oh my gosh, it just creates so much havoc, especially in light of the new neuroscience that we've been talking about. Is I would just invite everybody to just try on the mental exercise that like, what if there was no failure?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
if I can't fail here? What if I didn't fail then?
Yeah.
And what if I won't fail in the future?
Yeah.
then what does that mean? You
Yeah.
know? And just kind of deprogram ourselves and let go of these toxic stories of how all of the can'ts, all of the, shoulda, coulda, wouldas, all of that just melts away in a moment if you can practice that mental exercise of no failure. There's no failure.
Yeah, we do that in my program. I bring them in and they have to drop the idea that they have a drinking problem at the door and pick up that this is a teacher. It's an invitation to learn. It's an invitation to heal the disconnect between who they think they really are secretly and who they project to the world, and bring those into, being, so that you are a whole integrated person. And that
Mm.
if it wasn't alcohol, something else would have brought you to your knees,
Yep.
because you can't perform your way out of shame and failure forever. And what got you here, successful midlife, that's most women that I work with, isn't
Hmm.
going to get you there. And
Hmm.
so there is no failure. There's a needs gaslight on in your car, and that's not a failure. That's a needs attention. And I
Hmm.
think that looking and reframing whatever you're dealing with as an invitation to get real and to change the way you're operating, design your life differently,
Hmm.
is so valuable. And I
Yeah.
love the idea that failure is an illusion. It's a mental construct. So is marriage. So is money. So is next Tuesday. Like, all of these things are just ideas we make up and we all march in lockstep. But what if there is no failure? What if you can't fail at being you? And
Hmm.
maybe the only failure is your strategy failed,
Hmm.
but you are not a failure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd love to move now into some hopeful help for the audience. And you have a lovely acronym that goes with iteration. It's iterates. Can
Hmm.
you talk about what the antidote to all this failure and shame and performance based metrics are? Can you talk about how we move on into a different way of being and thinking?
Yeah. So iterates is a tool. It's definitely something for writing, not, mentally portable in any way because it's so long. But it's a way of basically stimulating ideas that are creative from within the person. And the way I like to use it is just to do like a Socratic method, like, what about this? How might you iterate in this way? How might you iterate in this way? And it's 8 categories of iteration. So the first one, I, is inspiration. So these are things like, it didn't take me a day to get here. It's not going to take me a day to get out, like a way of just mantra-ing your way through something to inspire or to make failure okay, or your ideas of failure neutralized. T is time. So the way the brain works is very time bound. Time of, when I, then I, to quote one of our coaches, Kyra. And that all of the frequency and the intensity of time and how often and all that kind of stuff. So that's another category that people like to play with, because sometimes people are expecting too much time to go to this and they need something that's faster or shorter or in the morning or in the evening, that kind of thing. The third one is your environment. This is the most popular kind of in the pop psych world, like moving the carbs off the counter so that you don't eat them, storing the wine somewhere where you can't see it. So it's not just sitting there vibing at you all day and then you eventually give into it, that kind of thing. The R is reduce. So you mentioned at the top of the hour, like reducing difficulty, reducing friction, reducing amount, like those kinds of concepts where we're just dialing it down on the thing that we want to avoid or we want to do less of. And then adding, so adding variety, adding spice, turning up the volume on something healthy, adding the size of your salad, that kind of thing. And then we have AT. T is togetherness. So in my research, nobody changed alone. It might have
Mhm.
just been the sample I was dealing with, but the successful people, no one did it alone. They most often worked with their spouse or a friend, and then sometimes coworkers, sometimes religious people that they had at their church, um, and sometimes like a professional group. But that and clinicians. And so, that we all have to find our people to help us. We cannot do this alone. And then the second E is expectations. So, if I expect one thing, we talked about this, if I have these rigid expectations and I can't iterate on them, then I'm going to just generate all kinds of failure ideas and stories. But if my expectations can be iterated on, like, okay, well, I didn't do that, but I did this. I didn't do what I intended, which was to drink only one glass today, but I drank two instead of five, whatever the case may
Mm-hmm.
be, so that I
Mm-hmm.
can really, reframe and set my expectations in a healthy way. And then the last one is an S. So one clever thing that you mentioned earlier is getting a mocktail instead of a cocktail. Those are called swaps. And making it this way or that way, more proof, less proof, that kind of stuff, so that whenever somebody's substituting something or swapping something, it's in a way to preserve their brain's preferences. So I am a sugar addict. I negotiate this every day. My last Starbucks soy chai was 3 days ago. I was stuck in town in the rain, and I just hadn't had time to get my caffeine in the morning, and so I did
Uh-huh.
my home brew. So I went for it, but I have iterated on it to reduce the sugar count by only having 2 pumps of chai, increasing the caffeine by having an added bag of chai tea added in there and making it extra hot. So there's just little ways that I've used the whole iterates model to custom make, and that seems to be the key to long-term success, is somebody's ability to make something that they enjoy out of
Yeah.
out of an iteration, out of a tough spot, do something that they can get the other part of them to do. That the other part was like, that's kind of cool. Let's try that. Or that I'm curious, or I feel well cared for, whatever the
Mhm.
inner dialogue is there with your
Yeah.
two parts of your person.
Yeah, I know that there are lots of emotions and ways of categorizing things, but I kind of have a litmus test. Is your heart open? Is your mind curious? Or is your heart closed and your mind closed? And
Hmm.
that's a felt sensation. And whatever idea you're coming up with to iterate, if it sounds good, then that's what will move you forward. Worst case scenario, it's not going to work like you think it does, and you're going back
Hmm.
to the drawing board. But if you don't have that sense of heart open, what you're actually doing is learning, because we're always learning that this is going to be hard or that I have to white knuckle this.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I teach women to use their bodies as a litmus test. And the
Hmm.
litmus test is this a good idea or a bad idea? We'll let your body tell you, because if it doesn't feel good and you push through that, even if
Hmm.
you get short-term results, you're going to set yourself up for a longer term problem, because there's
Hmm.
a belief there that this is hard, or it's not going to last, which I think happens so often with
Yeah.
people can change their behavior for the wedding. They want to lose the weight, or,
Hmm.
somebody's threatening divorce. So I don't have a drinking problem. I'm going to get all that together, or somebody's watching me, but then
Hmm.
they're performing the behavior as expected, and
Hmm.
they're not actually authentically tied and enjoying this experience, which means at some point there's going to be a bungee cord effect, boom,
Hmm.
because you're
Hmm.
not identifying this behavior as who you really are. And so you have to have your heart open. And if your heart isn't open to whatever you want to do, then that's not what you should be doing. Like, there you go. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well said.
The last thing I'd like you to touch on is the expectation part. Because I have a lot of work to do with women who think, because they're used to getting everything they want pretty damn fast. And they
Hmm.
already have gotten everything they want, except this one teeny weeny, tiny little drinking problem. And they expect, and this is where I teach them to fail, not succeed, because they expect, the literature shows, I think you can build a habit in like 21 days, maybe 60 if you like that other guy's research. But they don't understand that, yeah, you can build a habit, but it's got to be pressure tested and stress tested and practiced, and you will fail. So can you set realistic expectations for what you can really expect for a change to feel like a normal, natural expression of who you are
Hmm.
versus something you're trying?
Yeah, so it's the percent of the time that it shows up in your behavior naturally.
Okay.
That's how much you can tell a habit is matured or not. So it's not that, 21 days, you've got like a little sprout, of
Uh-huh.
some sort of, neuroplasticity, neural growth. Your nerves are like, okay, maybe you're interested in doing this more often. 60 days, you've got something that's a little bit more like a little tiny tree, right? Like a little plant, right? But just like you wouldn't let a little sapling that you're putting in your front yard, you give it a stick to hold it up. You wouldn't just, leave it to the elements and the animals and things like that. You have to continue to strengthen that habit until it is the default. Most of the time, you will do it that way. That's how you can tell that you've built a sturdy habit. Nothing short of that. And it doesn't matter if you build your sturdy habit and then you go boop, boop, like back to the old tree and because the old tree is always there, you're just not taking care of it, you're not fertilizing it, it will start to age and die off. But it's not going to be gone for a very, very long time. And
Yeah.
so your new habit, you're just investing, you're reinvesting, you're giving it compost, you're giving it fertilizer, you're giving it water, you're continuing to feed it, and it becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And it really doesn't matter what the old one is doing, except if you don't panic when you find yourself doing the old behavior. That seems to be the key, is for people to understand, like, if the old behavior comes roaring back and it gets you, so what? It's a game. 1 point
Yeah.
on the board for old habit. So what? you know, get back on the horse,
Yeah.
reinvest. And people who have the shortest, like I'll call it wallowing time in their
Uh-huh.
relapses, do the best long term. Because it's not how many relapses you do, it's how many times you close that gap and you resume with some sort of effort that shows that you've got motivation to come back. And that means by default that you have, beaten your ideas of failure for that moment in that context.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's all there is. That's why my program is a year, but all my perfectionists, I'm like, yeah, it's 3 months with 9 months of follow-up, same thing. Because they get it, they have the baby behavior, but then at some point life happens and I have practiced and they feel safe. And I think that's the one thing that you have to let go of, is that everything's behind you, and that there's ever a place where you get there and you're done. Like, well, unless you're dead, you're not done. And so
Hmm.
this, well, I haven't had any behavior that I felt out of control for months. So what the hell happened last night? Well, we could talk about it, but it did happen. And this is actually the test this morning. Life gives you the lesson first, and in this, what is it? Life gives you the test first and the lesson follows. And
Hmm.
it's really, I think, having to get over that perfectionism, that you're not ever going to make a mistake. Like, that's that is really, I think, what hurts the most with those of us who identify as high performance, is we don't like to see that we've made a mistake, and then we get stuck in that. It's like quicksand.
Yeah, and the perfectionism, just to honor that for a second, it got them a lot of good things.
Yes.
It protected
Yes.
them, protects us
Yeah.
from this or that or whatever, and it helps us to, get experiences that we want more and more of. So there's nothing wrong with it, but when you overuse it and you don't counterbalance it
Yeah.
with, there's either it's perfect and you're happy with it, or you learned something. That
Yeah.
second half of that equation is missing in these people, you
Yeah.
know, that
Yeah.
they're just ignoring. It's not that they're wrong about the perfectionism, it's that they're wrong about the times when they don't see perfection and what to do with that. They don't have anything.
Yeah. Like anything, it's a double-edged sword. It's a tool. And if you're holding the wrong end of the knife, it's going to cut you. And if you're holding it correctly, you can slice your way through a forest. So
Yeah.
understanding that perfection is also a tool, and
Mhm.
not cut yourself with it, is, I think, a novel concept that nobody ever taught me. That's
Yeah.
why I got to learn it the hard way. So there's
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And I think it goes back to what you were saying before, like the more we accept ourselves and don't reject ourselves, any part of ourselves,
Yeah.
because even the most unsavory, shameful part of ourselves was trying to do something to save us
Yeah.
or to protect us or
Yeah.
to get something, that we needed. And
Yeah.
so, bless the old shells, bless the old
Yeah.
skins that we've shed.
Yeah.
And, again, don't freak out if you
Yeah.
find yourself in the past,
Yeah.
your past behavior, just transport yourself to the future again.
For sure. And wisdom isn't stuff your mom told you and you listened. Wisdom is stuff you got to go out and learn it the hard way. So
Yeah.
everything can be a gift if you decide, but you have to process the shame first. It's not a gift as long
Yeah.
as so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I am the biggest fan of yours. Do you have anything that you're working on now? What's your next breakthrough for the world?
Yeah. So right now we have a couple things going. One is that we validated the iterative mindset inventory, which is a academically validated tool. It's 12 questions long and it's on my website, drkyrabobinet.com, so that anybody who wants to can go take that quiz and then get a packet of guidance that is psychologically and statistically and scientifically sound, that tells you about yourself and where you might be struggling or not, and that sort of thing. So that's a tool that is free. I mean, you can sign up for a newsletter or whatever you want to do, but it's not, I'm not trying to like charge people for this or that. That's not what I'm doing. I am really honestly trying to get the word out, because I truly believe, after 30 years of studying this, that this is the most potent medicine that I've found. It is the
Yeah.
most potent mindset. We talked about growth mindset. All due respect to Carol Dweck's work, iterative mindset is a furthering of the learning mindsets that she discovered, that she first articulated, and she went down the rabbit hole of growth mindset, which is very valuable, but it does not cause us to iterate. It just causes us to not think that we failed for now,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't give
Mm-hmm.
us forward motion about what the remedy is. And I find that to be incomplete without
Yeah.
the capstone of the iteration instruction that so many people need. And so I really, in looking at the data, iterative mindset is the most potent factor over grit, over resilience, over self-efficacy, over
Yeah.
optimism, even over learning-based goals, over performance-based goals. I could go on and
Yeah.
on. I guess I am.
Yeah.
But over all of these like standard bearers
Yeah.
for how we think we succeed, this is the key. And I stand by that 100%.
Yeah. Well, and to agree with you, Dweck has a study, I think, where she shows how a kindergarten or a kindergartner can learn growth mindset. But in your book, you have a story about a horse learning the iterative mindset. So I'm like, and that just speaks to the hope. Like anybody can learn this, including your dog. Like
Mhm.
Carol's was a kindergartner can learn growth mindset. And in your last book, that story of, and I won't make you go into it, but the gentle husband horse who had the iterative mindset was beautiful. And I just thought, wow, yeah, like if an animal that isn't even a human can learn this, then there's nothing you can't learn. And that's what I like want to leave the audience with. Like iterative mindset is a skill. It's not something you're born with. Just listening to this episode can show you that, well, maybe there's more that I should learn. If I think I should do something and I'm not doing it, maybe it's not me that's failing, it's the strategy, and there's tools and support out there.
Mhm.
So your work is so powerful and I can't wait to see what's next. Is there anything that you would like to say that I haven't asked you that, maybe we missed a puzzle piece anywhere?
We need more practitioners that talk like, think like, and are practicing the way that you are. And so I guess my call to action for all those listening is to think about, if you are a behavior change professional or you know one, to really alert them to this science. And they can prove me right or prove me wrong, but I really want to start a fire
Yeah.
around people who do what you do, because I can really tell how powerful it is, what you're doing and how you're applying this. I mean, that's my dream, because
It's
I'm not
changing
seeing
lives,
patients.
doctor.
Yeah, I'm
Mhm.
not seeing patients anymore. I'm not doing groups anymore. I'm
Yeah.
running a company that shares and studies these things in order to empower people to do that in their professional life. And I would love nothing more than the entirety of the health and wellness industry to start using this paradigm instead of this very harmful, overplayed, brain inconsistent, hurting our brains, kind of overperforming kind of way of doing things, which we're doing it because we got nothing else to do. We,
Yeah.
we don't have an alternative, and now we do. And so the
Yeah.
more we can get that out there, and get practitioners going and asking and talking to each other, helping each other out, and that kind of thing. I just really applaud that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. I feel like, there's the neuroscientists and the doctors, and then I just feel like I'm the translator. I'm the middleman. I'll read your books and I'll bring it in and put it in the program. And it is changing lives. The women in I have a money back guarantee on reducing your alcohol consumption by 80%. Thus
Right.
far, I've not had to give a refund.
That's amazing.
It's a year program
Um,
though. So yeah. All right. So can you let my audience know, you already said where to find you on your website,
mhm,
drkyrabobinet.com.
mhm.
And then anything else? You have a try app, don't
Fresh
you?
Try, yeah. So Fresh Try spelled
Okay.
TRI.com is the free software for habit formation. We do not have anything on alcohol use yet, but I really want that. But we do have healthy eating, exercise, negative thoughts, stress reduction, those kinds of habits so far that are all clinically proven. They pulled from the literature so that you're in good hands in terms of that. And we don't sell your data. We don't advertise to you. We're just doing this for, large employers, and you get to benefit because you get a free app that is very, very highly developed.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your work.